guys. So I'm just going to be running through DaVinci, just step by step through the whole program. Sort of trying to break it down as best as I can, and just sort of explain all the tools which you might need to use. But I think first I'll start with some color theory, which is kind of friggin' boring. But it's sort of important to understanding how all of these different tools that are in DaVinci actually sort of interact with the images that you're working with. And definitely, before I begin, I should point out that I'm completely self-taught, so not everything I say is like infallible. Like, I could say stuff that's wrong. There's also a very good chance that I will intentionally oversimplify things so that it's just easier to understand. And a lot of the stuff, there's some stuff I might explain, kind of go off on a tangent. I'll try and avoid doing that as much as I can. But yeah, apologies if I do that. Anyway, let's start. So first I'm just going to introduce you to all of the footage which I'm going to work with to sort of explain what I'm doing and what you can do in here. So first we've got a few animations which are just different color channels sort of mixing together. So I'll use that to explain something in a little bit. So it's just the same thing but blurred. And here it's just showing us some other color capabilities or potential, sorry. Here we've got a flat gradient from black to white. This is the same thing, but I've just put a little buffer of black and a little buffer of white in case I find that I need to visualize something in those points. This is just a gradient of every color, and this is the same thing, but with a buffer of red on either side. Otherwise, I've gone through and quickly corrected some footage which I shot, I think it was last weekend, or the weekend before. I mean, it's not perfectly corrected. This is actually a shot that I haven't corrected. I've got that for a very specific reason. But just so that I can show you a few other charts. And here I was doing an exposure test on the Canon C300 Mark II using some formats that I hadn't used before. And I've also already gone through and color calibrated a few things there. So I think the very first thing which I should show you is the color scopes. So to activate them, there's two ways. You can either go video scopes on, or if you caught that quite quickly, there's Control-Shift-W. So that'll get rid of them, bring them up. Now the reason these are important is what they give you are objective measurements of what's going on in the video space. What you're seeing on your screen is probably quite different to what I'm seeing on my screen. This orange might not be that level of orange, that red might not be red, and that green might not be the same green. And that just comes down to different monitor performance. I don't know what characteristics your monitor in particular will have, but I know for a fact, for example, that mine is in what's called a Rec 709 color space, or sRGB. They're almost interchangeable. There's very subtle differences. Again, that's a very tangential thing, so I'll ignore that. But essentially, there's just a lot of video standards, and this is inconsistent. Whereas what we know is the data here is data. It's just objective measurements of what things should be. So this is a really good tool to use when you're grading your footage, because you know you get a very objective sort of reading of what's going on over here. So we'll run through each of these tools individually, but first I kind of just want to make sure that you guys sort of understand the absolute basics of color theory. So the first color thing we need to learn is a pixel. Like, how does a pixel display color? So to sort of sort of summarize or simplify it, a computer screen has red, green, and blue subpixels. Together they come and make a pixel. And they can combine different colors. So if you have different combinations of red, green, and blue, you'll create different colors. So you can see where they're overlapping. For example, here, we're getting magenta, getting yellow. Or if I just skip ahead to this one, where they're overlapping, we're getting cyan. So what that also tells me is that the furthest these colors can be pushed is absolute blue, an absolute red, absolute green, absolute magenta, absolute yellow, and an absolute cyan. So that means everything else in between will almost be less pure. And that's sort of getting into that color space thing I was talking about, with is the sort of the range of colors which you can get into. So when I talk about color space, I'm almost just talking about, like, imagine I've got a set of crayons. It's got 12 colors, and let's call that like the video color space. And then imagine I've got a cinema projector, which has a better range of colors. So that's a set of crayons with 18 colors. So they've already got more colors to work with than we do. So that's sort of what we're working with. We're working with a video space, which is actually quite condensed. The standard at the moment is still what's called Rec 709, and that is going to be 99% of the monitors you currently work with. Anyway, so that's sort of the red, green, blue system. Different combinations of these pixels will create different colors. So if we go here where I've got this gradiented one, where I softened it, you'll see you'll get different colors as they merge and overlap in different places. We can also jump over here. So all of these are just different combinations of red, green, and blue pixels doing some funky shit to make different colors. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to explain is the parades and the waveforms. I'm going to explain them together because they're basically the same thing. So the parade is the red, green, and blue channels separated, and the waveform is all of them combined into one graph. What this is, if you're unsure about how to read it, is a left to right reading of the image and all of the luminescence values. So what that means is at the very top, if it's up there, it means that particular channel. So at least here, for example, blue is 100% activated, green is 100% activated, and red is 100% activated. And that's represented over here as well. And that means we're getting this white thing. So if I decrease the exposure of this, you can see as it gets darker, so too does the graph. Nice and easy. Now to prove that it's a left to right reading, I'm actually going to pop up with a photo. So let's go with something with a bit of movement in it. So this one's a good shot. So as I sort of scrub through this, we have Martin walking in, so you can kind of see that was his arm and his body in general. And then the whole scene shifts in tandem with this pan. Now I guess what's important to note is that this movement is very exaggerated because it's a pan. If we were to tilt up, you wouldn't get that same sort of shift left to right because it doesn't actually track that horizontal axis in the same way because it's taking all of this vertical data per horizontal, column and tracking it on here. Whereas if we were to tilt up, you would just get this sort of morphing of all the data. Anyway, so let's get back to the parade and waveform. So what this is showing us is, as I said before, that colors are different combinations of these different channels. But the thing to note, I would say, is if I go over here, so where they're all separated, and I'm going to reduce the saturation. Notice how the different channels start to sort of blend and merge. Now that's a side effect of the fact that as they sort of need to desaturate, they also need to introduce the other color channels. So if we're trying to desaturate red, we're going to reintroduce green and blue to that circle to, remove the amount of red in it, because it's the only way it can sort of faff about with the colors. If it were just to be the red channel, so like let's say it was just the red channel activated, and it were to decrease by itself, again, that'd just be me doing this adjustment. It's just reducing exposure. It's just going to sort of lose its brightness or intensity. You're not actually going to lose saturation. So that's something to note on there. So again, I guess I probably should have defined this as well earlier, is that colors which are neutral or lacking in color are just different shades of all of these channels equally. So if we do have white, which we have here, and again I decrease it, you can see it just becomes grey and then black. But all of these channels are equal because they're creating a neutral color. So that's how you create greys or less saturated things. Okay, so that's the waveforms in a nutshell. The next one we'll talk about quite quickly is the histogram. So again, it's similar to the waveform in that it's a representation of the red, green, and blue channels and their sort of luminescence value, but rather than going horizontal, it's just giving us an overall reading of the image. So this is a really good way of gauging exposure in a very broad general sense without looking at particular localized parts of the image. So for example, we've got this character here, and he's sort of creating this darker slump in the image. Same with Tom sitting here. We can sort of see where he is there on that graph. Whereas there's no way to interpret any of that data on the histogram. That just is just a bunch of light data. There's nothing sort of spatial about it that can inform us about what is in the image. So for example, here we've got that blue on his chair, which we can see quite evidently there. It's a light blue, so it's registering more up in that high end. Whereas over here, there's no way I could tell that that's there. Or I mean, you might be able to pick it out there maybe, but I can't definitively say that's what it is because there's no way to correlate them. So that's the histogram. Don't really need to talk about that too much. The next one is where it gets a bit funky and a bit tricky. So it's the vector scope. So what the vector scope is a representation. I'm just going to reset all of this stuff. And again, I'm going to be using these tools to demonstrate different color things. I will show you how to use them, but for now I'm just trying to use them to demonstrate different color shit, essentially. So let's go to, you know what, let's use this one. This is a good thing. So this has got all the different colors at 100% saturation. It's important to note that at 100% saturation. So I'm just going to quickly go through and reset this. So it's back to default. I'm just going to increase the intensity of that so we can see what's going on a bit more. So what this is a representation of saturation. I'll explain exactly what it's doing in a moment, but I should just sort of describe the diagram first. So first, we've got all of these colors at 100%, and see how they're making this sort of hexagonal shape. I think that's the right mathematical term for a 6-sided shape, hexagonal shape. And see how it gets quite pointed. Now that is a result of only having the 3 color channels, red, green, and blue. And then only ever being able to have at 100% 2 of the channels, because if we have 100% blue and red, we'll get magenta. If we have 100% red and green, we'll get yellow. If we have 100% green and blue, we'll get cyan. And that's all represented on here. If we have all 3 channels activated, we'll get white. So what that's telling us is we can't get extra points between these 6 sort of marks. So what these marks here are sort of targets. And that's for, I believe it's 75% saturation. So if I decrease this to, let's say about there, that'll do. That's close enough to the center. What we're getting is what's called broadcast safe. And that means when you put this to television or online or on, generally speaking, the colors will appear as they are. And this is typically as saturated as colors will appear on most multimedia platforms that are to a broadcast standard. So you kind of want to stick to keeping all of your colors within that space. But also, I would say 9 times out of 10, having your colors saturated beyond those points, particularly in a normal image, will look absolutely like just fucking gross. Like that's just not a nice aesthetic. So you'll probably want to bring it back. But I should explain a few things about this system. So I might just demonstrate them and then explain the system itself. So first, I'm just going to bring the saturation back a little bit. So the first thing, and hopefully the tools will play nice with me with this, is that as we decrease luminescence, so how bright the image is, we will lose saturation. So that's working. I'm darkening the image and we're losing saturation. Yep, so that's good. The next thing is if I increase the brightness of it, we will lose saturation as well. Now, I'm going to try and use the gain tool. Hopefully that'll do the same thing. Nope, okay. We're not going to use the gain tool. We're going to use the lift tool to sort of increase that level of brightness. So you can see as we approach white, we lose it. And let's just, for fun, let's see what the gamma tool does. Okay, it's just going berserk. I'll explain what these are doing later. But that sort of thing where as you increase the general overall brightness of the colors themselves, or you decrease the brightness of the colors themselves, that you lose saturation, is a result of the color system that they're using. So I'm just getting a bit distracted because I want to test one more tool to potentially do this. This is probably a better way of doing it. So this is increasing the brightness of just colors. Now it's sort of struggling just because of the way the mechanics of the tool work. But you can see, for example, that green is getting less saturated as I brighten it up. And so is the red, just a little bit. But it's getting this weird little lateral shift and the blue is kind of also desaturating a little bit, but not as much as I would think. I imagine that might be a side effect of some color spacey crap, but again, that's getting tangential. Anyway, let's get back on topic. Now that is a result of a system that's used quite frequently throughout this whole program, and is kind of, in particular, why I want to explain it, is partially so that we can explain the vector scope, but also so that you guys understand what's going on in these other tools. And that comes down to sort of how data is stored or captured on an image. So I believe Anna talked about some of this in class. So she talked about luminescence values, which is how bright and dark something is, and then she talked about chrominance values, which is sort of color data. But that can be broken down further beyond just color data. So you've got your luminescence values, which is how bright it is, but then color data can also be broken down twice more. We've got what color is it, and how much of that color do we want. So that comes down to what's called the HSL system. So I'll just quickly get a Chrome window up so that I can just Google some graphs. So let's go to HSL. And hopefully we'll get a nice representation of it. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with things like color wheels. So this is our first value, which is the hue value. What the hue value is just a measurement in degrees. 0 is red, 300 is magenta, 240 is blue, 180 is cyan, 120 is green, 60 is yellow. And essentially what that is telling us, sorry, I don't know why I switched windows, is what color do we want? So when we have 0, we're saying we want red. If I were to chuck a number at you, say 90, I would be saying I want between green and yellow. I actually don't know how to describe that color. Let's say I said 210. So that's probably going to be this sort of sky blue color. The next value we're looking at is saturation. So we're asking ourselves, how much of this color do we want? Now this is probably a better graph to display that. The closer to the center will be 0, and the further out will be a higher number, say 100. This is a hypothetical way of describing it. 100% saturation. So if we're 100% saturated, we're saying we want a total of that color. So if I want 120 at 100%, we'll get green. If I want 300, so I know that's magenta, I know I'll get 100% saturated magenta. Now, if I were to say I want 50% saturated green, that'll be halfway. If I want 10% saturated green, that'll be sort of 10% of the way. And then the last thing with this is that it does incorporate luminescence values. So what that means is how bright the image is. So the higher up this sort of cylinder that we get, the lighter the colors we'll get, and the lower we get, the darker the colors we'll get. And what that's sort of telling us is, well, one, well, it's not really telling us anything. I don't know what I meant by that. Yeah, so that's HSL. So you've got your hue value, what color? You've got your saturation value, how much of that color, and you've got your lightness value. So how light or dark is the color? Now there's a few thousand different representations of this system, and they're not actually all called HSL. They've all got different random friggin' names. Like for example, this vector scope in Premiere will actually be called the YUV vector scope. You don't need to know what that stands for, but again, it's also just referring to HSL stuff. So we're going to jump back over here, because what's funky about the way that vector scope works is that it's not that cylinder. Yes, it's a top-down view of the cylinder, so all of that data is compressed into a 2D plane, viewing that cylinder from the top. Which I should point out is, the way I like to summarize it, is it's just a coordinate system for colors. So you're defining 3 values of the cylinder of color, and you can pinpoint what part of the cylinder that you want, and that's telling you what color you will get. It's just a way of defining colors. Anyway, what that YUV vector scope is showing us is actually more like this. HSL solid cone, whatever you want to fucking call it. So what that's telling us is that the way the computer is interpreting it, using that vector scope, is as the lightness of something increases, because of the way that RGB shit works, it inherently loses saturation. So it actually becomes less saturated and sort of shifts closer to the center. And the same if it's sort of darkening. So you've actually got this top-down view of these sort of like 2 cones stacked on top of one another. And that's why on that particular graph, as I increase or decrease the lightness, the saturation values also increase or decrease depending on where in the image that occurs. So this is another way of looking at it. This is from Canon, apparently. And yeah, you can see they've sort of shrunk the graph as it's getting closer to maximum luminescence and minimum luminescence. I keep saying luminescence. There's actually, I believe, a difference between luminescence and luminosity. I'm sort of accidentally using them interchangeably. But the thing that they note here is that the most saturated you can get is when you're at 50% luminescence, or luminosity, I should say. That's where you can get your most colorful colors. I don't think this graph here particularly well represents how the desaturation works as it approaches the center of the color wheel, though. So that's the vector scope. So what I will do is, again, I'll just show you what happens if I decrease the brightness. You can see how you lose saturation. And similarly, if I just paying attention to the colors and ignoring the fact that the black is changing color, in theory it would just be isolated to these colors. Note how as they increase in brightness, they also desaturate. So that is the scopes, and we're going to be using them as much as we can to sort of evaluate images. That being said, I don't believe in most of this tutorial I'll actually look at it that much. But when you're working, you should always be paying attention to what's going on here, and it's a wonderful tool for sort of comparing different shots and matching shots between images. So yeah, now we can move the fuck on. So I actually missed one thing, which I'm just chucking in as an insert. So on all of these, they've also got these little controls here. So you can change the intensity of different effects. So I'm just going to bum this up a bit, and you can also change the intensity of the markers. The other thing is some of them will have a zoom, so you can expand the sort of resolution of it. Note that if you are zoomed in, these targets become useless on the vector scope. The other thing on the vector scope is it has what's called the skin tone indicator. So I'm just going to turn this shit off. All this is a line which dictates the hue angle in which the human skin sits on. It'll either sit on that line or I think about 2 degrees to the right. So I'm going to bring this back up. We're going to leave this 2x zoom on for now. And what I've done is I've just gone ahead, isolated my mate Martin's face in this particular shot. I'm not too concerned with the exposure values and any of that stuff. And what I just want to show, I'm not going to explain this tool that I'm about to use, but just how you can play with the skin tones, and that is a way to correct them. So this would be considered correct. This would also be considered correct. These are perfectly acceptable ranges for the skin tones. But like, let's say he came to me like that. Obviously that would be wrong. So I would want to shift him back to that point where he rests nicely on that line. Yeah, so that's just the skin tone indicator and just a very rough overview of skin tones. Okay, so I've jumped ahead a little bit, and what I'm just going to show you guys is how to set up your projects, or at least your footage, so that you can edit and play with these tools down here at the same time as me, if you want to do that. So essentially what I'm going to do is set up the project in a way that Anna didn't. Now, I didn't want to interrupt her in class just because I thought that would be kind of a twat thing to do. So what I'm going to do instead is just show you guys how it should be done. So I talked a little bit about color spaces before. I used an analogy of having 2 different sets of crayons. So essentially, imagine we've got the set of red crayons, as in red the brand, which is the camera they shot on. And then we want our video crayons. So we need to kind of translate, okay, what would the red crayons look like if they were on video crayons? And we've got to do that for 2 different things. We've got the color space, which is the crayon thing I was talking about, but also what's called a gamma curve, which is just sort of how the image is tonally mapped across these crayon color spaces. The simple version is we're just taking it from one thing and putting it into another thing, converting formats essentially. So just follow with me. Essentially, I've just set these 2 things up. You don't need to know what's going on here yet. All you need to know is at the moment, the video is going through this effect thing, and then this is the output, and that's what it's doing. So this is what it should look like if we set it up correctly. Now, I've already done it how I know it's supposed to go. but I'll show you guys how to find out, particularly for your graduate films next year and the year after. This will be handy because when you're shooting Alexa or you're shooting on the RED cameras, you'll need to do this to properly color grade. So what we're going to do is do a color space transform. So first I'm going to show you how to find the data that you need. So we need what's called the, what's it called? Sorry, obviously. We need the color space and the gamma. That's the two pieces of information we need. So I'm just going to open up a Finder window, or File Explorer, sorry, on, what's it called? My bloody computer. I'm going to navigate to any of the footage that Anna's chucked me. So let's just go rushes, red footage. I can pick any of these folders. That'll do. So I'm double clicking it. I've already got the red, what the fuck's the program called? Red player installed. Hopefully when I click this, the player will open. Well, it doesn't want to. So this is the shot that I've opened up. I'm not really concerned with anything here. What I want to do is go view metadata. I've already scrolled down. Oops. So essentially just got all the information about the shot. Most of this doesn't matter. Anna did point out that it does tell you what the color temperature was when they recorded it, the white balance. And she actually did that incorrectly as well, so I'll explain that later. But for now, all we need to know is gamma space, color space. So we know it's red gamma 3 and red color 3. So just remember those two things. I'm just going to disable this. Come over here. And what we need to do is apply this color space transform to this. Now, you might not have this panel here to open that. It should just be OpenFX. So you just click up here and it'll pop up. Scroll down until you find it, color space transform, and you just drag it on. So for you guys, you know what, let's just reset this whole thing. Bang. So that's what it's going to look like for you guys. I'll drag that on. All you need to do is go into here, input color space, we want red color 3, input gamma, we want red, I passed it, red gamma 3, output color space, we want rec 709, output gamma, we want rec 709. So now what we've done is brought all of that data and put it into our video space. So now all these tools should operate normally and behave in a way that works well for us. The last thing I'd like to say is if you want to follow along, don't apply any other effects to this, what's called a node. What we're going to do is create another node, and that's what you can play on. So we're going to right click, go add node, add serial. So it's just created another thing in which we can put effects on, completely independent from this other one, which is good. So now you can faff about with all this trash and you're not affecting this original node. The other thing to note is that if you decide you don't want to just play around with one particular shot and you want to move between shots, you can copy paste effects. So if I just click this one, double click, sorry, Command C, Control C, whatever it is on your computer, and just go to different shots, I can paste it. Paste, paste, paste. Perfect. Good. The other thing is, again, I just want to remind you that if you do want to fiddle around with the colors, it's important that you do go add node, add serial, and you then play around on that second node. And you should do that on every shot that you're going to play with. I will show you a shortcut for this shit later, but for now, that's just probably the best way if you're just mucking around with the footage. Okay, so I'm going to go on my first tangent that I'm just going to actually allow myself to go on. If you're not particularly fussed about that exact process and you don't have any questions about why I've done that, you can skip ahead. I'll try and put some sort of visual indicator in the edit somewhere so that you know you can just sort of fast forward until that thing is gone and you'll know where to skip to. So some of you might have asked, okay, why did you use that color transform effect rather than using a LUT? So if you don't know what a LUT is, it stands, LUT stands for lookup table. Essentially, it's just a filter for footage. It can make things look wildly different. You have film emulation LUTs that try and make digital footage look like film stocks. You have stylized filters to try and make things look like Mad Max. And then the other one, which we're concerned with right now, is called a utility LUT. What a utility LUT does is converts one set of footage from one space to another, or from one gamma curve to another, or multiple things at once. So the reason I didn't use a LUT is for data preservation. So I'm actually going to jump back to that other timeline. So this footage was all shot in Rec 709 color space using what's called a Canon Log 2 gamma curve. Now this was the one shot that I hadn't actually corrected. I had set up this sort of thing here to demonstrate what's going on, but first I'm just going to chuck up my video scopes so I can see what's going on in terms of the data. So I've got two streams of effects, so I'm just going to turn each of them on one at a time. So this top one represents what happens when we do the color space conversion thing, and this bottom one represents what happens when we use a LUT workflow. In fact, I'm just going to reset this, and I'm going to reset this, and then I'm just going to disable them. So we'll actually start with the LUT so we can see what's wrong with it. So the first thing is I'll activate the LUT. So that's what happens visually when I do that. So far it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Okay, it's a bit blown out in the highlights, but let's try and recover them. So the first thing I'm going to do is just sort of set a black point, just bring down the shadows a bit more so that it looks a bit more punchy and contrasty. And now I'm going to try and recover the highlights. So I'm going to bring this down. You'll notice this is just a very flat looking sky. Like all of that data which was once there, I'll get it to a point where it's quite exaggerated on that graph, is just this big homogeneous line. So I'll expand that so you can see it a bit better. This line up here. What that's telling us is the data is being compressed or cut off, and we've actually lost it. So what that means is if I actually zoom in over here to where that light data is we've got this. So if it's blown out, it's blown out. But at the moment, it's just this big homogeneous blob of white. Now we actually don't have to have it like that. So that's just a limitation of how a LUT works. Whereas if we use this color space transformation effect, so I was just turning that little thing off, which didn't actually do anything. If we use this color transformation effect instead, what we'll be able to do is actually recover that data. Now we know we have that data there because we can see it's there. We've got these nice little soft fall-offy boys in the waveform. That's not the technical description of it, but that'll do. So if we go back to this color space mode, so we're activating the color space transformation. Again, it's cut it off again. I'm not saying it's perfect in that way. It still requires a correction. So let's activate this layer. I'm going to use the curves to do this. So I'm going to look at the waveform, bring it back down so I've got good shadows, and then I'm just going to bring my highlights down. You can see all that detail in the clouds that we just didn't have when we used the LUT. Now, a little pro tip is you can use this high soft thing, which just creates what's called a knee on the top end, and then if I bring it down, I don't have to be quite as dramatic to get that detail back. But it just means you end up with nicer dynamic range, better sort of data preservation, and an overall nicer looking image. So that's why we're using this instead of LUTs. Okay, so I've jumped back into my old project to start to run through the other effects. You can apply all of this stuff to Anna's footage as long as you're on that node which occurs after all those weird color transformation-y crap. It should all act like normal. So we've done the color checker. Now we're going to move along to the color wheels. So I'm just going to run through each of the effects and try and avoid too much application because that encourages me to go on tangents. So the first from left to right is the lift control. Now each of these have color controls that let you push certain parts of the image. So you can see this one's doing the shadows. This one should be doing the midtones. And this one is doing the highlights. Offset will shift the whole image one way or another. Now I should probably just get my bloody scopes back up because that's a good way of seeing what's happening as well. So I'm just going to spin that around. Well, you can see here, for example, how it's actually pushing the colors around. And you'll see offset just shifts the whole thing. This is not a good image to show you that. How about we go with this one? Bang. So offset. See how I'm shifting it around? It's for the most part, it's shifting in quite a uniform fashion. the next effect in here, well, I guess the other things as we should discuss is these have individual controls. So the other thing you can do other than just applying color is also manipulate the exposure and image properties, so the tonal properties of the image. So if we go back to this gradient, you'll see what happens. You can see this is sort of a representation of the tonality of the image, and you can start to see exactly what these effects are doing, which is particularly why I put this one in here. So if I increase the lift, you'll see it just sort of brings up that bottom end. If I do the opposite, it'll start to crush it, and you get this big black patch. Do the same thing with the gain, it'll do the exact same thing, but for the high end, the white parts of the image. So reset that, and then you'll see gamma just does a nice curve up and down, adjusting the overall sort of brightness of the image. You can also manipulate the individual color channels, but I'll discuss that in a little bit. So this is just the using the color wheel, but you can actually manually dial these values in, but you can't do it in this particular window. So I will get to that if you decide you like just putting in numbers. The next thing to talk about is the lift. Sorry, not the lift, the black point. So what the black point does is it lets me pick a part of the image and it'll set that to be black. So I'll pick something that's relatively low end. If I click here, and what that'll mean is everything darker than that becomes black. And I can just reset that. I can do the same thing with the gain. If I use this white point picker, anything that's brighter than this will become white. So everything further than there-ish. Now the other thing you can use that for is to fix color sort of shifts. So I'm just going to jump over to this particular shot where I think I've actually already done it. Yeah, so I kind of already tinkered with it a little bit. So this is one of the few places where I will give you a pretty direct application of something. So what I'm going to do is just create a parallel node. This lets me just disable that. So now the route it's taking is this effect, then this one, and here. So this is just that color transformation. That was a color calibration thing. So now I can just play around with the colors. So what I'm noticing here is in the low end, we're getting this sort of warmish bias. So what I can do is click this one, click there, and you'll notice these are not the same values. You're getting imbalance. Now what that's doing is correcting that tone in the shade. So what I'm going to do is then bring this back up to 0. And now what I've got is that shift, that shadows imbalance. It's been fixed, but I actually haven't changed the overall tonality of the image. So that's a really good way of fixing those tonal things without making any decisions about how you want the overall exposure. I should point out now actually that you've got these 4 values. So you've got Y, R, G, B. Y stands for the luma, so how bright it is overall. RGB is the individual color channels. Now we can do the same thing in the highlights as well. So if I take this, click that white point that's on the color chart. It actually hasn't done anything because it's perfectly happy with where that's sitting. But say that was, say, 1.03, 1.019, 0.99, and then that was 1.5. I could bring this one down back to 1, and now I'd end up with a very neutral exposure, or at least I wouldn't have affected the overall exposure. So that's a really fun thing you can do. Well, not fun. It's a thing you can do in the program. The other controls you have, so I'll just jump back to, say, let's just go on this shot here. You have a white balance picker. So what you can do here is pick something that is a neutral gray color, white or black. Typically, anything that's not completely blown out or completely desaturated that is gray will work. So let's just zoom in on this tent. And I'm just going to assume that this tent, I'm just going to press escape, so I'm not using that tool anymore. I'm just going to hit save as well, just in case it crashes like it did before. Just going to click that. Let's say this tent, we are going to assume that that is the right thing. It'll do a white balance correction on that and try and make everything relative to that white. Now, I'm not sure if that tent actually was grey. I actually can't remember. But for now, I'll just reset that node. So that's the white balance. The other one you can just always just click auto white balance, and it'll do its best to fix it. It's pretty happy with how that image was set. Auto balance. I actually can't remember if that does the whole image or not. It might. that being said, I just... Actually, no, it has done something. No, it hasn't. Cool, never mind. I lied. I just rarely use that because I prefer to do it manually. So you've got these two buttons down here which let you switch between these two toggles. First is contrast. So contrast will affect the amount of middle tones that you have, mid-tones in the image. Sort of, I'd like to define it as the difference between the brightest points in the image and the darkest points, or how much there is between them. So if I increase the contrast, you'll see the image gets really punchy and gross. If I decrease it, it gets quite flat. So I'll just reset that again. Again, all of these have little reset buttons if you decide you don't like what you've done on those particular effects, or you can reset the whole thing. This is the primaries wheel section. I don't think I mentioned that. The other thing you can do on the contrast is actually change what part of the image it defines as being the center. So currently it's set to 0.435, but you can see I can shift that so it thinks higher up in the image is the center and lower in terms of the luminescence values. So you can play around with that as well, the pivot. Saturation, that's pretty straightforward. It will increase the saturation or decrease the saturation. And you can see it affecting the vector scope over there. Sweet, so I'm just going to reset that again. Hue. What this will do is rotate all of this stuff. You'll see it spinning it. So essentially what this is telling the colors is, I'll reset it. So currently it's set to 50, so default. So we've got this orange tint. Yeah, we've got this orange tint. I'm going to put the skin tone line on. The orange tint probably sits on that skin tone line. If I were to shift this, oh, that's the wrong control. If I were to shift this, say, so that that orangey part would line up with magenta, I know that that's magenta. In fact, I can get going. It's now pointed towards blue and it's gone blue. You can see that's the sort of the tint there, I believe. And I can keep going. I can make it cyan. And if I just spin it all the way around, I'll make it green. I can make it yellow. Like, I can do whatever I want in that regard. So this is useful for if there's an overall sort of hue imbalance across the whole thing. That's pretty rare. Most cameras will be fine. So you probably won't need to touch this effect, but it's handy to know about it. The next control is the color temperature. So what this does is lets you warm up and cool down the shot. Now the way this control works is if we look over here, as I increase the warmth, you'll notice the red channel goes up. For the most part, the green channel should stay put, and the blue channel will also operate in the opposite direction as the red channel. So if I cool it down, the blue channel goes up, red channel goes down. So I'll reset that. And then similarly, the tint will operate the green channel, and the red and blue channels will move simultaneously. So if I push it towards magenta, the green channel decreases, red and blue increase. If I push it towards green, the green will go up, and the blue and red channels will go down. I'm going to reset that. Mid-tone detail. This is the same as the clarity effect in Photoshop or Lightroom. What it does is increases contrast in the midtones, but nowhere else. You'll see, yes, over here it is affecting the bottom end a little bit, but that's just sort of more incidental stuff. So you can use that to really just get a bit more detail out of your image without sharpening it. Color boost. This is the same as a vibrance effect. What this does is increases the saturation of less saturated colors. That's not to say that the more saturated colors won't get more saturated. It'll just try to bias the desaturated colors. If you go the opposite direction, it will desaturate the less saturated colors first. And then you have shadows and highlights controls. So you can bump up the shadows, you can bump up and down the highlights. So yeah, you can use those controls to do that. So the next stuff I will walk through is in the same effect. Now, most of these effects have these little dots on them. Sorry, I'll just put that back. Most of these have little dots on them. So before I talked about how you could change the individual color channels. So if you go to this second effect, that's where you start to gain control of that. So you can start to push certain parts of the image and only affect individual color channels. They do have applications, so for minute color changes, but but for the most part, I mean, I typically stick to this control. I just find that more intuitive. But if you're someone who likes to type in numbers by hand, go for it. So the next thing we're going to talk about is these log color wheels. Now, these behave differently to the primaries wheels, which we talked about before. And I think that's best demonstrated on this graph again. In fact, we'll use the one with a bit of a black buffer so we get an even more exaggerated sense of what's going on. So if we stay on these primaries wheels and I push the colors one way or another, you see there's a much greater shift, particularly in the blacks. They don't get preserved at all, especially if I push it all the way to the edge. Now, the log wheels won't necessarily not change the blacks, like they still do it, but what you'll find is a greater preservation of those sort of roll-offs. Like it's less likely to hit those points of your image. The other thing that's unique about it, so it's sort of like almost like a softer effect. See how none of this top end is being affected, just the low end? Whereas in the previous effects, if I go back to the left, see how the whole image as a whole is being moved around? Whereas on the log ones, it won't affect the entire image, just that bottom end. Now, the other control it has, so yeah, you can bang that up and down for exposure style sort of stuff. It also has definitions for where it considers those low points to begin and end. So you can really fine tune this stuff. So I'm just going to reset that. And it's the same for the midtones. This will just affect the very middle and the highlights, just the highlights. An offset is just exactly the same as the previous one. It has all these controls which are identical to what's going on over here, the exception being where you define the low range and where you define the high range. It also has this second panel, exact same as before. So that's the color wheels section. So I probably should have played around with those wheels on an image, but I guess you can just sort of experiment with that yourself and work out what it looks like. So now we're going to move on to the curves. So if you're familiar with Photoshop, this should not look too unfamiliar to you. Essentially it just lets you sort of manipulate how the image is interpreted, sort of on a... I'm trying to avoid using the word curve to define it, but that's exactly what it is. You can sort of play with particular coordinates on this left to right interpretation of the data. So the bottom left is black, the top right is white. I'll just reset this. So what that means is if I want to reduce the overall brightness, I can just do this and sort of bend this curve. In fact, this would be similar to using the gamma curve, or basically the same thing. The gamma curve almost does identical stuff. If I want to bring up what is considered black, I can just drag this up. If I want to completely blow out the highlights, I can drag that around. And you can do some really funky things with the curves if you start to just experiment with them. Now, a way I can visualize this, or what's occurring, is on the waveforms. If I go back to these, what's it called? Gradients, and I apply the same things, you'll see it's almost a one-to-one translation. This graph is almost perfectly replicated up here. You can start to see how it's manipulating that data. You can select individual color channels. If that's how you prefer to work, go for it. That's fantastic. Have fun. For some reason, I don't know why, I just prefer to use color wheels and using that sort of, some of the other effects I'll show you later, to translate color in that way. But this is a fantastic tool, especially if you know how to use it well. The other thing to note, particularly in this section, is the soft clip and low and high. So what this low and high do is let you define what point is considered black. So essentially you can see this is kind of like just compressing and squishing the data. Now it's kind of an ugly way of doing it, and same with the other end. You're getting this massive band of just flat grey. It looks gross. What I think is more useful, and you can also separate the channels individually, but what I think is more useful is the soft tools. Now you can see what they're doing here. in the low end is it's a more gradiented effect. So what you can do is you can soften out the lows, and then you can bring this back down. On an image, there'll be more practical applications for that. Obviously, this is just all a hypothetical gradient thing. So I'm going to actually show you one application for it, which is up here. So as you can see, I've used the high soft. And what that's done is, by default, it will be here. You can see that's one homogeneous mass of shit. What I've done is just brought that up, and suddenly I've got all this data in the clouds back. Now, that is to say it will make your highlights. I do have some other things on there, so what I'll do is I'll just reset it. Depending on the shot, it can affect your highlights. So just be wary of wary. I actually can't remember which version of the word is the correct one there. Just be careful about it. For example, I believe it was this shot where I was playing around with it before, where you can, sorry, I'll just set this up as a separate effect. Sorry, just 2 seconds. Where if I look at Tom's arm and I use this soft thing, you suddenly see it sort of compresses the highlights. Now, I haven't properly looked into it, and if I isolate his arm, I could see if it actually is overexposed and needs to be brought down anyway. But that's just something to be careful of, and just be conscious of, because you can see it also does affect saturation, for example. Actually, I'm just going to get that out. Yeah, that was sweet, sweet, sweet. Cool. So that's the tonal curves. That's right for experimentation. I would absolutely play around with that one. It's a very powerful effect. So the next one we're going to look at is we're just going to go through all these dots. And I'll do my best to explain these in layman's terms. But this is where it really starts to come in, that HSL thing I tried to explain before. Hue, saturation, and lightness, or luminance. Because these effects rely heavily on your understanding of how that works. But in its rudimentary form, what this is doing is it lets us say, I want to make this color another color. So let's do something that's quite dominant. So let's start with that orange. So what I'll do is I can use this picker tool. Like if I pick the qualifier, I can actually pick it. I can press there, and it'll actually make me a nice little tag so that I can change the color. You can see what's occurring is if it's on this line, it'll stay the exact same color it's supposed to be, and if I shift it around, it'll change the hue. So that's also defined down here for each of these points. It'll say what the starting point, what start hue it was, and how much you're shifting it. So I'll reset this, and let's use one of these presets, and let's use the grass, which I believe is actually sitting more over here. Actually, you know what? I'm going to expand this out. Delete that one. Sweet. Yeah, so now we can really, we can make the grass any color that we want. So where this is particularly useful is on skin tones. So for example, let's say Tom's skin here was purple. I could select the purpley parts and shift them until they are back in that nice skin tone section using the skin tone lines. The last part of the control is, what's it called? If you have a point selected, you can click here and it'll create, I think it's pronounced Bezier, whatever. It just lets you sort of really play with and fine tune how the curves interact in these points. So the next effect is hue versus saturation. This lets you define a particular point in the image based on its hue value and change the saturation. So if I do the grass again, for example, so I'm just going to click yellow because most of that grass did sit in that range. See how I can change the saturation of just the grass and not affect any other color except for that sort of greeny yellow color. Exact same thing, you've got your input hue and you can change what level of saturation. So you can also dial in numbers manually. Yeah, that's pretty straightforward as an effect. Hue versus luminance. Sorry, I'm just going to take a quick sip. Hue versus luminance. Similarly, you can define a certain point in the image. So let's do the grass again because it's nice and easy. I'm just going to protect that orangey section, and you can see how I'm changing the brightness of the grass. I wouldn't use most of these effects super dramatically because you can see if I do this any more than just a little bit, it gets really ugly. And same if I go just more than a little bit, it gets really ugly. But it's there. So if you find that maybe you want to brighten the skin tones, you could do that. That would be perfectly acceptable use of this. Luminance versus saturation. So what this is saying is you're trying to affect the saturation of the image based on what parts of it, based on the luminance. So down here, if we increase this, it'll increase the saturation of the dark parts of the image, and if we increase it over here, it'll increase the saturation of the light parts of the image. So for example, if I want to decrease the saturation of, say, the shadows, this is a good shot to do that. I can click here, and then really subtle, you'll lose all the color in the shadows. Now let's do something a bit more dramatic just to really show what the effect is doing. So if you look in the lower end, the darker parts of the image, the shade, these buckets, you'll see suddenly it's desaturating the image. Now what this is particularly useful for is if you have a lot of chroma noise in the shadows, so that's noise which is colorful, you can chuck that on there. You will lose the chroma data in the shadows, but that noise all just becomes luminoise, so it's just change in tone. And to most people, that will look more visually acceptable. And that being said, in the shadows, most of the time there isn't actually that much saturation data anyway, so most of the time it will just be noise that is there. So let's reset that. Same controls down there and same Bezier thing. The last one is saturation versus saturation. So this is kind of like a mix of the saturation and a mix of that saturation and that color boost effect. So you can make more saturated colors even more saturated. So for example, if I do this side is more saturated and this side is less saturated. So if I reset that, what I'm doing here is telling it to make the more saturated colors even more saturated. And if I do this, I can make it the less saturated colors less saturated. You can see now all that's standing out is those colors that already were saturated. So it's a nice way, an easy way of making colors pop in a sort of interesting way. Like if you just want skin tones to pop out, for example, and everything else to sort of fade into the background, or you want to apply a monotonous tone color thing to things, that's a perfectly acceptable way of using it. So the last thing before I move on from these curve stuff is I just want to talk one last thing about the hue versus hue. There is one creative look or thing you can use it for. Now every color grading tutorial would not be a complete color grading tutorial without trying to show you some sort of orange and teal look. Now that uses the basic color theory that complementary colors look nice together. So there's this cliche thing for Hollywood films that they have orange colors, so that sort of skin tony look, and then everything else sort of fits in that tealy zone that is the complementary color of skin tone, and it just automatically makes people pop out of the frame. So what you can use this hue versus hue effect for is to push your colors and try and morph your colors to kind of go one way and the other way and try and avoid having things in between. So the way I think it's best to do that is probably just using these presets to start off. So what we already know is we've got red, yellow, green, I think that's cyan, blue, and magenta. Yeah, that is. The other one we have is skin tones. So that's going to be sort of slightly closer to red. So it's probably going to sit around here. And the other point I probably want to select is that, what's it called? Tealy part. Which I believe, so if I've defined my skin tones as being 275, let's do some quick math. 275 minus 180 is going to be about 100, 95-ish. So let's do 95. So, oh fuck, nailed it. So that's going to be our target. So what we're going to try and do is just using this graph. Not going to, maybe, you know what, let's also have the image up. Let's just push things one way or another. So this is just one creative way you can use it. So just looking at that graph, I'm going to bump up this shit just a little bit. Don't need to go too extreme. Just sort of push it closer to that skin tony point. And then down here, that's green, so I'm probably going to push that more towards... Okay, this green kind of actually wants to go a bit warmer as well. Let's go that route. And then over here, we'll take purple. I'm not entirely sure why there would be purple in this shot, but for the sake of this, I'll still do it. And then we've also got the red, so we're going to shove the red a bit more towards the skin tones. And let's also get the blues in a bit more. And here as well, let's bring that back. In fact, we can probably... I think the grass looks nicer when it's warm. Anyway, if we just turn this on and off, you can see the difference in that effect. Now this is a very naturalistic way of changing that color to that orange and teal aesthetic without actually adding color, because all we're doing here is multiplicative. So we're just transforming the data. We're saying we want to shift all the greens and make them pink, purple, blue, yellow, orange, whatever, it doesn't matter. Whereas all of these tools are additive, they're adding color. And personally, I just think that adds, adding the data just kind of like, it muddies it. You start to lose the natural look of the image. Whereas if you do use these hue effects, it does tend to sort of result in less noise and a more natural aesthetic. So you can see the difference there. Now if I presented this to you without that context of turning it on and off, it would also probably look quite normal. You wouldn't even think twice about it. So the next panel we're going to walk through is called the qualifier section. Now what this lets you do is define certain parts of the image, and then you can apply effects just to those parts. So you can combine these qualifiers with any effect, and what will happen is the image will just be applied to those areas that you define. Now this uses the hue, saturation, luminance system, which we've already discussed, so we'll start with this one because it should be the most familiar to us. Now what it lets us do is pick certain color values and just affect them. So let's just go on this boy here, and what we'll do is decrease the width, and what I believe the effects that's currently on there is a desaturation, which is not really what I want. So I'm just going to reset it. Okay, we're back to normal. So now we can't see our selection. Yeah, so this is what it would look like if I had no effect applied and I've just got my qualifier. So at the moment I'm selecting different tonal ranges, whatever, and I'm defining the center using a hue value. I can change the width, I can change the gradient in which it's selected them. So the shortcuts you need to know here is Shift H will show you a mask of what parts of the image you've selected. So if I keep shifting this around, if I soften it, you see what sort of selection it's making. And I believe if the symmetry controls which way the sort of softening is going. So I'm just going to reset that. The other control that you have with Shift H having been enabled is up here. If you click this, it'll display it in black and white. So the way the computer is interpreting this data, what I'll do is just soften it out, is as a black and white mask. So the way it sees it is everything that's white has been selected and everything that's black is deselected, and everything in between is kind of selected. Don't know why I clicked that. Anyway, so I'm just going to go back to this grey mask just for now. The other thing you can do is select things based on their saturation. Now this is a terrible image to use because everything in here is 100% saturated. So we'll jump back to this wide to demonstrate what that can do. So let's tinker with that one. So for example, at the moment I'm deciding I want the more saturated colors because I've selected everything but that. It's important to note in this that what you would identify as being the visually correct thing. So like, honestly, actually it'll be easy to explain what I'm about to explain with the luminance thing, so I'll just keep going for now, sorry. And then I can also give a max range if I would like, and I can again feather those things with independent softness. So essentially if I applied an effect, like making it all red, and I press Shift H, you'll see it just applies to that area that we defined. But what I was about to say was that these graphs in particular don't really behave how you'd expect them to. So for example, if I go over here and you would expect that if I bring the luminance up, press Shift H, that kind of like everything probably beyond there, this is the one with the black buffer by the way, everything beyond there would be selected. But if I hit Shift H, we got nothing. I'm not entirely sure why that is. I believe it's just the way the program is dealing with the color, and I believe it has to do with just a lot of maths, but you just kind of have to just deal with it because I've never been able to find a solution. So what we're finding is that it actually takes ages for us to find that black 0 point, which is quite annoying. But again, it's the exact same controls. You can soften it. We can also pick certain parts of the highlights. And again, this is the same friggin' thing. It's like for some reason it treats 75 as white and about 50 as black. So you're kind of working with this in this range of 25, and you've got all this wasted crap all over the place. It's very annoying. And again, we can get that viewed as black and white, what we have and don't have selected. Yes, let's bring the high down, for example. Yep, sweet. So that's what we've selected. Now you can use all of them in combination. It's really up to you to decide why you might want to do that. The other tools that are available to you to pick these colors is using these color pickers. So for example, I can pick Tom's arm. If I press Shift H, you'll see it selected around there. In fact, I can just draw what I want and it'll pick it. I can also go minus and deselect shit. That's a bit too finicky. So you can play around with it in this way. You can also go additive and just, that does once you've made your initial selection, you should start to use the additive if you want to add things, because otherwise it'll reset the selection. The other one is feather and minus feather. This will more subtly add things. So for example, if we go in there, you can see it's kind of like smoothing out what it wants instead of absolutely selecting it. You can see it's reflected down here, and that was a really extreme example, and it didn't play too nice with my selection. The last control here is invert, so it'll actually take everything we've selected and select everything else. So the way that looks here is, this is what we selected, and if I hit the invert button, you can see it's selecting everything else. So I'm just going to reset this again. And what I'll try and do is get a decent enough selection on Tom here. So I'm just going to start with this. Then I'm going to kind of manually go, let's change the width a bit. Let's get more of the skin tones. I think we can get a little bit more saturated, a little bit more on the low end. Let's get a bit more of the shadows, but not too much. Let's get a bit more on the high end. That'll do for the sake of what I want to explain now. So again, I was talking about how it sees all this data as black and white. So you've got these controls down here to sort of clean it up a bit. So the first one is black clip. So what this is doing is sort of crushing the blacks and the way it's seeing it. Now you can see that on the waveform over here, is it's bringing everything down. And you can do the same thing with the white clip, is it'll blow out the highlights, at least on this mask, and sort of just increase the overall sort of gain on the white end. The other controls you've got is clean black. So what this does, not entirely sure how it works, is it'll take the parts that it's deemed as black, like this homogeneous thing, and try and get rid of all the little weak parts of the selection. So for example there, and you can do the same thing with the white. So you can see it's kind of filling in the blanks. You've also got a blur control, so you can blur the mask. This will make it look a bit more subtle. So I would highly recommend blurring most of your masks, because most of the time that's the right thing to do. And the last one is in and out ratio. So this lets you expand the mask and shrink it a bit. Yeah, so that also has certain applications for cleaning it up. So you use these, you make your selection, and you kind of use these to sort of just clean the selection a bit to make it a bit more subtle. So for example, let's say I did make him really red. What I could do is also blur it more. And you can see the selection looks a lot less obvious. Like it's still there, obviously, because I've made it orange. But you can see it was a bit less apparent where the selection exists. And a bit more subtle. The other thing is it also reduces the amount of noise up there. So that's that particular qualifier. There are a few more that you can use. We've got the red, green and blue qualifier, so you can do individual color channels. I'm sure there are applications for this, but I very rarely use it. You've also got a luminance one, which is exactly the same as this one here, except it's just for luminance. You can always just turn these individual effects off and it'll just ignore that particular value and just select all of them. The other one is the 3D picker. Now, this one would be very difficult to explain what it's doing, but it's not too difficult to explain how to use it. So I'll just explain how to use it, and I can't be bothered explaining what it's doing. So essentially this is one where you just draw. You draw what you want. If I shift H, you'll see what colors it's going. So then I can also say, I do not want green. Fuck off green. I hate you. And it's gone. It's going to say, do not use any of the values which we've covered. And it's trying to map out in 3D space what colors it wants using that coordinate system. In this case, it's using one called YUV. You can change the softness of your mask and selection. Again, it also still has these controls down here. If I unshift H, you can see it's got this show paths thing, so you can see where you've drawn. And let's see what happens if I tick despill. I don't know what that's doing. I should probably know that. What the fuck? Okay. I'm not entirely sure why it's doing that. Does that have to do with that? That's something I'll have to Google later. But yeah, you can also add more selections to it. I'm just going to deselect despill. Maybe despill restricts the general color range to avoid you accidentally selecting things. That's just conjecture. I have no idea if that's right. I might say I don't want blue. Okay, well the blue didn't change, so I think that's wrong. Now if I hit Shift H, you can see I've made a selection. So this is actually almost, if you just like doing this particular route, it's probably easier to use than the HSL. You can just see I've just been faffing about. Let's turn off despill. And then the other one you can change is the color space. I'm not sure how much that would actually influence it. I use this, but like I just kind of play around with it, which is a terrible thing to admit, but like I just kind of fiddle around with it till it works, whereas the HSL, I think I have a better understanding of how it works. So I'm more inclined to tinker with that one and really get to know it. Anyway, that's the 3D key. So the next thing we're going to cover is the windows. So you've got a number of different types of windows. Essentially these are like masks in After Effects or Photoshop. You can discover what these different tools, like these different particular shapes do. For now, I just kind of want to talk about just their general behavior, not the individual, like what a linear one does, what a circle does, what a polygon does. So let's set this up. I know what I want to do. So this shot, I'm going to really roughly track Gemma, which is the girl sitting here. It's going to draw around her. I don't really care how accurate that is. That will do. So you do have different controls over here. Transform, which lets you scale the size, which way left and right it goes, rotating it, etc., etc. You can also change the softness. So again, if I press Shift H, why? How strange. Oh, it's because I haven't, what have I done there? If I hit Shift H, I can see what thing I've selected. So I can change the softness of the mask. I can change the softness inside the mask. I can change the softness outside the mask. You can do as many things as you want with it. Now's probably as good a time as any to point out that there is this keyframes window over here. You can keyframe most things, and this behaves exactly the same as in most pieces of software. I'm not going to explain how keyframes work because there are 1,000 other tutorials online that probably explain it better and more succinctly than I can off the top of my head right now. Anyway, so I've made this mask of Gemma. The other thing is just remembering that you can combine this with the qualifiers. So what I could do is let's say I've got Gemma walking through a sea of orange dandelions that all happen to be the same color as the skin tones, but I still want to correct her skin tones. I could track her face and track her, isolate the skin tones, modify them, and really carefully make sure I track the mask through the whole thing to avoid changing the colors of those dandelions. Not sure why I chose dandelions, but that was my random example. You can also change the opacity of the mask, which is sort of how intense it is. Yeah, so that's the mask in its most simple thing. So it just lets you apply effects to very localized, isolated areas. where it gets interesting is where you can combine it with the tracker. Now, I'm not going to go too nuts with this, particularly getting it right, and I'm just going to cover the basics because I could sit on the tracker for hours and hours and hours. So the first thing is you can track forward and backward, you can track frame and frame. Each time you pause it, it will create a keyframe. In fact, what I'm going to do is just create one right now. So there's this little keyframe control. So let's go track backwards, and I'm just going to turn off the mask. Now you can see it's picking up on Martin. If this was actually my project, I would pay more attention to it, but for now, just because this is just an example, I'm not going to bother trying to fix that. So let's just continue to track. Gemma's out of the shot, we're good. So the reason I pointed at keyframes before is one, this is using the keyframe system to sort of track to certain points, and then it creates keyframes. As you need the mask, you could keyframe the opacity as it dips out of the frame, for example, so that you don't have this effect floating off on the side the whole time. There are different types of trackers, there's different modes. I would just encourage you to play around with them until you understand them. Really, this stuff here, for example, this shot, I probably don't need perspective 3D tracking, but I'm just going to leave it on for now. Again, this is something just to play around with and find out what do these things do. It'll just take me way too long. Like I could sit here on just this effect for half an hour trying to explain, okay, do this, 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 and this. What you do need to know is your mask might change. Like for example, Gemma turns her head. Now let's pretend I needed to change the mask to adapt for that. This automatic tracker will not do that. All it's trying to do is track this shape across that. What I can do is switch to the frame mode. It'll preserve the same keyframes. What I can do is skip to a keyframe, or I can put a new one in if I want. And I can actually adapt the mask. And what will happen is this shape will change over time. So you can see between those 2 points, it's stretching out. So let's do something even more dramatic so that you can really see it. Let's put it over there. So you can see between frames that's changing. So that's super useful if you're trying to, say, track someone's turning head. That was an example I got the other day, where you might need to sort of condense or change the mask, and the program just isn't quite keeping up with you. Now, I'm not 100% sure, but I think maybe in 15, the tracking is just slightly better and might actually do a better job of doing that, but we're kind of stuck on 14 for the project just because that's what the uni computers are on. The other effects we have in this particular panel, we have the stabilizer. This one, super simple. You press stabilize. It analyzes the frame and it'll stabilize it. It's very similar to the warp stabilizer, in Premiere. I can't be bothered waiting for it to stabilize the whole shot. The things to note are the cropping ratio. That will dictate how much it zooms in and its willingness to do so, and smooth, which will dictate how much smoothness you get. The zoom function, I believe, I haven't used this one in a while, so it's kind of just not on the tip of my tongue, but the zoom function, I believe, will preserve, it's sort of like the perspective thing in Premiere, sorry. So if you do zoom in, it will preserve that zoom, whereas if you don't tick that, it'll try and counteract it. And camera lock will attempt to make the shot look like a tripod shot. So that's useful for getting rid of handheld stuff. And there are different modes. So these are, if you find that you get a shit result with perspective and none of your faffing about can fix it, maybe just try changing to similarity or translation and just seeing how they behave. The very last thing in here is the FX tracker. And to be completely honest, I don't think I've ever used it. My guess, no, I actually haven't used it. My guess is there are particular effects in the OpenFX thing, like for example, lens flare, which you might chuck on your footage to get a lens flare. I'm not even sure if that's available in the free version. I believe that tracker will let you track the lens flare across the shot, for example. Yeah, anyway, that's tracking. The last thing I might check, I'll just have a look, is this key effect. This sort of lets you change different properties about the key. So that will be a combination of your window and your qualifier stuff. This is an effect that, again, it's just beyond what most people will need to use. If you're interested in it, you can look into it. Sizing, this stuff is all self-explanatory. So pan will shift the frame left and right, tilt up and down, zoom in and out, rotate it or rotate it. Width will stretch it. Let's reset that so we can see that. Width will stretch it. Whoa, long boys. Height will make them look like tall boys. Pitch will sort of tilt the photo sort of away from you and towards you, and yaw will do the same thing but left and right. You can also flip it horizontally and vertically. There are different sizing options. You can fix lens properties. It didn't really do anything there. I imagine, what's it doing there? Okay, well, it's decided there was no lens corrections to make. Whatever. You can also crop left and right. You can. This is actually kind of useful if you can't be bothered doing that masking crap to isolate skin tones, for example. You could just crop their hands, for example, and you'd get a nice reading over here of mostly their hands. Yeah, there's a lot of duplicate stuff. This is again just something to fucking play around with. Just taking note, input sizing occurs before everything and output after everything. Yeah, so that's just stuff you can do in your own time. 3D, I don't think is activated in this version. I think you have to pay more for that. Okay, so I'm just going to run through the last few effects that are available. But I'm just going to race through them because they're sort of secondary sort of things. So the first thing is the blur effect. I'm terrible at explaining this one for some reason. I don't know why, but I'll do my best. So essentially radius defines, at least in this case, how blurred you want it. The distance in which it'll sort of approximate, sample pixels for the blurring. It's sort of just like an intensity slider. If you actually go the other way, it will just sharpen it. Yeah, that's another use of it, but there's actually a sharpening tool which uses the same interface. Horizontal and vertical ratio will adjust sort of which direction it's going to blur in. I'm not sure why that exists. I imagine it might be for if you're not using square pixels, or maybe if you've shot anamorphic. I'm not entirely sure. So if we jump over to the next one, it's sharpen. So again, it has the exact same controls. So like, let's say we just sharpen just a little bit. So this is telling us the range in which we're going to sharpen, and this is sort of telling us how much to sharpen within that range. So this is a more precise control. So if you don't know what sharpening is at least the way I've heard the unsharp mask described, is it looks for points of contrast between pixel to pixel ratio and tries to increase that contrast to get more detail out of it. Now most cameras by default, particularly cinema cameras, will be quite soft because they're designed to be sharpened in post. Just looking at that compression that I just noticed. Yeah, so that's a result of some bad grading that I've done in a previous effect. So I'll have to look into why that's occurring. Maybe if I just reset that. Yep, that was it. So you can see I'm just getting more detail out of it. So if your image is looking soft, there's nothing wrong with sharpening it. I would say though, sharpening is typically something I like to do at the very end, because just it sort of plays, it looks nicest when you sharpen at the end. If you sharpen at the start, it can begin to interact with your other effects and keys and make them look a bit shit. But if you have a logical reason to sharpen before or earlier in your time, in your workflow, bloody just go for it. So that's the sharpen. The other ones is this. This is the RGB mixer. You can play around with this. The one thing to just look at is this preserve luminance thing. So for example, if I go back to my circle boys, let's get them to fit. Let's shrink this a little bit. You'll see as they're separated, if I leave preserve luminance on, you'll see it kind of it looks a bit funky. Like it just plays around strange. Whereas if I turn that off, you'll see it just goes black. There's still a little bit of blue left. That might be because this footage is actually already compressed from, I think it was Premiere where I quickly made this animation. So that might just be the result of compression that's putting color data into the pure like blue and green stuff, like for example the red that's in that other one. But yeah, you can play around with that if you would like. You can also make it black and white, and you can play around with the different intensities of the channels. Yeah, have fun with that one. Oh, cool, and that lets you swap channels. How nice. I actually have no idea. I very rarely use that effect. And the last one is tempting to use because like they all look so nice. Like, oh, what if I wanted motion blur? But I think the moment I activate it, yep, it's going to yell at me. So that's only available in the paid version. And that includes noise reduction, which I will typically do at the start of my thing. That way all my masks and qualifiers and all my effects kind of just are noiseless, and I don't have to worry about the noise in them. But for the most part, at least at Swinburne, I think the process will be work on this at home and then dump it into a full version grading suite just to do your noise reduction and spit it out. If you can be bothered, it might not even be worth it. At least for submission, there's some things which they're very accepting of just because they understand, okay, you had the free version, or there's just not enough time to do a really solid grade on your project. So yeah, that's another thing. It's just beyond this. It's just learning when to cut your losses and just do things en masse, brute force, just to get it done on time. Because there's no point worrying about the minutiae of Tom's eyeball in this particular shot where you should be just grading and correcting the whole thing. But so far I haven't really discussed much of that process. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the node tree. If you're finding that it's missing, you can just click the nodes button up here. So let's just, for the sake of this, pretend that none of this crap exists. That's just a bunch of input stuff to get us to a nice point to start. So we're just going to pretend it looks like this, and that's how your footage probably looks. Or you've got your 3 layers, where you've got your color chart and your conversion thing for the color space, and then you've got your one you've just been playing around with. So let's pretend this is the one we're playing around with. So it's pretty straightforward in terms of this part. So the first shortcut we'll need to learn is S. I'm actually just going to see what the fuck happens if I hit some other buttons. Nice. Okay. Cool. I learnt nothing doing that. So if you hold Alt and S or Option S, you'll create a new serial. Cut to here. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is nodes. This is actually the first time I've tried to explain this, so apologies if it's kind of just a bit jumbled. If you don't have this up here, you just click nodes. Now let's pretend this is the one that you've been playing around with. So you know how you've got your color chart thing, your conversion LUT thing, sorry, not LUT, specifically not a LUT, your conversion color space effect, and then you've got the one you've been playing around with. So the shortcut for a new layer, or node, sorry, is Alt S or Option S, and it'll just create a new serial. Now you can make as many of them as you'd like. So the serials will just go, okay, let's apply the effect here, and then there'll be another serial, and let's apply another effect, and let's apply another effect, and so on and so forth. Now once you have 6, 7 different serials, like I haven't done it here, it is good to change label, type something in, rigor, that'll do, and just label what they are, because you will forget what they are if you come back to it after a while. If you right click them, there are a number of different effects you can add. For example, you can add a LUT. So I've got some of my own in there. There's some utility LUTs, I've got some creative ones. Honestly, I bought this pack and I've only used it on like 2 projects when I was just in a bit of a pickle. Like, I was like, oh crap, I don't know what to make it look like. And otherwise, these 1D LUTs are utility LUTs. These are designed mostly for tonal information to switch from one space to another, but I prefer not to use them when I don't have to. So yeah, you could apply a LUT. Now, other than the serial node, you can also add a serial before, so just put one before. I'm sure there's a shortcut for that, but I can't remember it right now, because I haven't had a serious grade in a little while, unfortunately. The other effects we have add parallel. So what this does is it adds two effects which will refer to the previous node. So in this case it's a bit confusing because we've got this parallel mixer there as well. So what I'm going to do is just set this up in a way that makes sense. So we've got parallel, there we go. So where this is useful, let's say, so what it'll do is it'll take the video data from this for reference for this node, it'll apply the effect and then combine them here. You can have as many parallels as you want, so you can go add parallel and you can keep going. You could have 600 of them if you want. Now this is super useful organizationally. You can just use it in that way. You can just have different effects stacked because you're like, I want these all to occur at once, but I want to be able to control them individually. So where I might have, say, a highlight push, a midtone push, and then on this one I wanted to do this weird curvy thing, but I want to be able to disable them or enable them separately. I can do that with independent controls. Whereas if I had done this same ugly curve on this effect, there's no easy way to turn it on and off by itself. I have to turn off these effects as well. So you can use it just organizationally in that way as well. But it's also important for, say, and this comes into that part where Anna set the white balance and the color checker. So by making everything orange, it can make it more difficult to key things, for example. So let's actually do that. Let's pretend I've decided I'm never going to use a parallel mixer because I'm salty. And I don't like parallel mixer because the letter P angers me irrationally. So let's say I take this node here, so this one here, sorry, and I do push everything to be orange. Nice. I love this look. It looks amazing. It's my favorite look ever. So add another node. And I'm like, okay, I want to change the color of the grass. So I go to my hue value, I click this, let's hit Command H. That was surprisingly good, all things considered. It kind of just like shat on me for trying to make a point. But you can see we've also selected, let's make this even more extreme. Let's just push everything orange. Okay. And then, crap, it's annoying when you're trying to explain something and be facetious and then it kind of like doesn't work. Let's give that a shot. Yeah, but you can see it's selected a lot of shit which I didn't want, whereas before the grass is green. I can more easily select the green. So let's, for example, disable this layer. Let's turn that off. Let's reset it. What you can already see by disabling that layer and selecting what's been selected, it can't select anything because there's nothing orange. So let's reset that. Let's try picking the grass again. See, it's a lot easier to just pick the grass, or at least that green part. And I could faff about with this to get rid of that tent if it was a different shade. And then I could apply an effect to the grass. So for example, I could make it blue. But now let's say I've done that and then I re-enable this layer. Suddenly this effect just doesn't fucking work. So what you end up with here is two things. One, it's more difficult to key. I know before I just tried to show you that and it kind of like, it fucked me and it did a pretty decent key, all things considered. But generally speaking, when the colors are different, it is easier to key them. Another example is, let's say the person's skin tones are a little bit, let's say pink, and let's say there's a very skin tony looking wall. If I correct that person's pinkish skin to be closer to where the wall is, so that skin tone color, and then down the line I want to isolate that person's skin tones, it's going to be a lot harder because now their skin tones are the same color as that wall. So the way around that is using the parallels, because what that means is if I take this, in fact let's convert it to a parallel, so let's, I'm sure there's a better way of doing this, it's too late at night for me to think about this. I'm going to delete that, and then, oh, wait, what I'm going to do is just sort of connect these points. Let's delete that, let's give him that one, let's give him that one, and then let's connect that there, sweet, and let's delete that little dude down there. Even though this is completely overpowering, I'll just bring it back a bit. You can see that I'm still able to apply an effect just to the grass using this one. Because what it's taking is that green data from that previous node. Now this is sort of the main use of parallels is when you've got a lot of qualifiers that require particular sets of image data. So for example, if this is your starting point, this aesthetic, and you've used that as reference for your qualifiers, it's a good spot to put them because it'll remain consistent regardless of what you do. And same here. Yes, that's the parallel mixer. You can also just use it organizationally, as I talked about before, so just having separate effects separated across multiple nodes. Now there is another style of effect, or sorry, layer, style of node system, which is add layer. What this will do is, let's push one that way. Let's do it. Let's just do it a bit silly. Let's do that. So that everything's a bit purple and everything's a bit green. And you can see it's only applying the green effect. Now what this is doing is, this will work with any of the masking tools. So you can use a qualifier for this. You can use the windows for this as well. So for this, we'll just use windows because it'll be easy to explain it. Now, I've made a window. So now the green is being applied and then the purple's everywhere else. And let's go purple. So you can see we're getting this overlapping thing where the effect is being sort of only applied to specific areas. So it first defines this area and it'll apply the effect. If it overlaps with this other one, it won't apply this effect where it overlaps. It'll put the green over the top. So that's useful if you have particular effects you want to isolate, and then you also want to have effects in places that, and you want it to make sure it doesn't have these other effects. I can't think of a very particular use case for it, but I'm sure there are some, and I have used these layers before. I just can't think off the top of my head. Also, it's like 1:30 in the morning and I'm starting to get a bit sleepy. Yes, that's layers. And the last one I think is worth discussing. Well, I think a lot of them are worth discussing, but the last one that you might find useful is add outside. Now this is a very simple effect. Essentially, if I've created a mask, let's say I've put it over here, and I've also added a qualifier which just selects the skin tones. Let's just pick that. I'm going to guess that's not a good mask. Let's reset that one. Let's just go with the 3D one because I'm feeling lazy. Nice, so that'll do. That's my mask, and that's where all my effects will be applied. So if I push everything orange, hypothetically, let's turn this off. If I go add outside, it will create an effect which relies on the masking data from this previous one, and it'll apply effects to everything else. So I can then get the most amazing orange and teal look I think I've ever seen. But that is a use for it, to be honest. Is what you can do is select a lot of shit that you like, or the focal point of the image. Select the inverse. So let's just pretend that's actually a good selection. What I'll do is I'll just get rid of this ugliness there. And I could, for example, just lower the gamma a bit. And let's say it was a better selection and I did select his whole face. You'll just see that everything except for the skin tones is decreasing, or where we selected before is decreasing in exposure. So it's a nice way of making the skin tones pop, for example. Yeah, so that's the node system. Using the parallels, I hope I explained why order of operations is important. You just kind of don't want to do things that will affect effects down the line. So you kind of do want to pre-plan what you're doing. I think it's outside the scope of this video to actually walk through an entire grade. So I hope that by giving you a lot of the tools which you might need to use, or like just explaining and walking through them, that it will have helped in some way, and that you can sort of work out how to put the pieces of the puzzle together and just play around with it, to be honest. I don't have any test footage to do dust removal on, which is a bit annoying, but that effect is pretty straightforward. The only thing to concern yourself with when it does come to that, particularly for 16mm, which is where you'll actually have dust removal stuff to do, is that it might require you to convert the footage to, I think it's DPX or Cineon files. Okay, so I'm actually chucking this in after I finish making the video. I just wanted to run through one thing which I realized I forgot, which is actually quite useful. So let's chuck up the video scopes using that separate scopes window. One thing you can do is, so Anna did mention this, is you can sort of take stills and then compare shots to those stills. So, crap, I actually completely forgot how to take the still. I think you right click, you go grab still. Then let's say I tinker with the color, push it that way. If I click this image wipe button, I can compare my before and after. Very useful. I can do it whichever way I want. There are a number of different ways of doing it. You can faff about with those different controls. So yeah, so that's the image wipe. I'm not sure, does it work with 2 clips? Yeah, it doesn't. It does not work with 2 clips. Yeah, and the other thing, which I think was also important that I should talk about, is split screen. So, if you have multiple versions of a clip, if you click that, it'll show you all of them, and you'll get the scopes for it. I'll just chuck that there, and you can compare it to the original footage. You can compare it to all the footage in groups, which I will talk about later. Oh, there's a teaser for something fun I did at the end. For some reason, you can also do it with just selected clips. So you can compare 2 shots. So I can go bang, bang, or sorry, bang. If you hold down Control, or I think maybe Command on Mac, you can compare multiple shots. If you scrub through the timeline through the clip timeline thing, it'll zoom through. You can also compare it to your neighbor clips, which sort of automatically adjusts as you scrubble through. But yeah, I think that's enough. So I hope this has been useful in some capacity. If you have questions, I know this sounds kind of dicky, but Google it first and then come to me if you really need an answer. Because there are a lot of answers on Google. Just also be smart about it. If something seems a bit sus, but yeah, I could have also gotten stuff wrong. That's 100% possibility. I'm sure I've said some shit in here that I'll look back on in 2 weeks and be like, why the fuck did I put that in the video? Anyway, I hope that was useful. Oh my god. I forgot that was there because I normally have 2 screens. Anyway, you can also have your scopes down here just by clicking that, and you can get to your different scopes. Oh, I wish I knew that. Yeah, because normally my workspace is in 2 screens, so I've got my scopes on another screen. Yeah, so I think that's everything. You've probably tuned out already, but if you're still here, there's a few other things I'll just ramble off. So I did stress that you shouldn't trust what your computer screen is showing you. And that's still very true, unless you're in a nice calibrated, you have a nice calibrated screen, high quality screen, it's probably not going to give you accurate colors. But one way to test your video stuff is just to put it on multiple sources of screens. And that'll get you a nice wide variety of sort of environments where you can sort of gauge, okay, on a Sony television, it'll look kind of pink, but you just kind of deal with that because most people might not have Sony televisions. You just want a very broad thing. But that's where those scopes come in, is they just give you very objective things. The only time you should look at a monitor and go, that's probably what it'll look like, is on a reference monitor or a calibrated monitor. They're not going to ever give you 100% accurate. I don't think that's physically possible. I could be wrong. But they will give you a close enough, like, objective measurement of what a television or a screen should be outputting. And that's the sort of baseline you should be using. And I think that's all I can think of for now. Oh, no! You are lucky you stayed, because there is one bloody amazing shortcut that I think is definitely worth it that I did not cover. So if people have already bloody tuned out, they just missed out on the best shortcut that I can show you. So you can't do this in the edit thing, so I don't know why I clicked that. But if you click multiple effects, multiple clips. In fact, let's go back to the one where we have Anna's stuff. So let's go back to Anna's timeline. Let's just go to the bedroom. This will save you so much bloody time. And that's why I saved it to the end, like a little nugget at the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to reset this stuff. Again, there's a shortcut for it, and I have lost it. So what I'm just going to do is reset. So what you can do, we've got this thing set up. Let's get rid of that one. We don't need that. Sweet. So we've got these 2 things. They're calibrating it with the color chart, and they are changing the color space. Now, let's say I've got 9 clips, which most of you will have, like is your edit together. What you can do is you can select multiple clips. You can right click. You can go add into new group. You can call it bed shots. Bam, bed shots. They are now all in a group. And what you have up here is a set of 4 clips. 4 points where you can put grading. So you've got your group pre-clip. So this will apply effects to everything in that group prior to the clip effects. Then after the clip effects are applied, or nodes, it'll apply the group post-clip. So you can put stuff there as well. And then you've got your timeline. So you can put things across everything in the project, in the timeline. So what this is useful for is if I create a new serial, I go here, I copy, I paste, go to the group pre-clip, I paste, I go here, go to my group pre-clip, and I paste there. Suddenly across all 3 of these, we have that same correction thing applied and that same color chart. Yeah, so I probably should have put that earlier in the tutorial, but I didn't. So yeah. The other thing that this is useful for is it means you can sort of do mass corrections, minute corrections for your shots in the clip section, and then in group post clip you can actually apply your creative effects like your grade. So for example, if I went that really basic orange and teal look, I could put it in the post clip and suddenly I've got that look applied to the whole thing. Now, I don't think the orange and teal matches this genre. It is pornography. Obviously there's not any nudity in the footage we got, but I don't think it tonally matches. It's not like a Hollywood production. It's meant to be sensual and erotic, so probably wouldn't go with orange and teal, but there you go. That's where you can put your grade and save yourself time doing that, because in theory, if you've corrected all your shots to be quite balanced, neutral, and uniform, when you apply the grade, it'll work almost flawlessly across all of them. You'll just have to go back and maybe tweak 1 or 2. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Thank you for sticking around. This is probably like an hour and a half, a 2-hour video now. Good night.